When Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sat down for what appeared to be a routine interview about trade relations, nobody expected what would happen next. A simple question about agricultural exports turned into a startling confession that has sent shockwaves through Washington's corridors of power. The question seemed straightforward enough. Is China following through on its commitment to purchase American soybeans? But Bessent's response revealed something far more alarming than anyone anticipated. The United States, once the undisputed architect of global trade rules, now finds itself in an increasingly vulnerable position. And the uncomfortable reality is this: Beijing is slowly but deliberately reshaping the terms of engagement. This isn't just about farming anymore. What we're witnessing is a fundamental recalibration of economic power, where critical supply chains, advanced technology, and geopolitical strategy have become intertwined in ways that threaten America's long-standing dominance. From the farmlands of Iowa to the semiconductor factories of Taiwan, from artificial intelligence development to naval routes in the Caribbean, the United States is facing simultaneous pressure on multiple fronts. And China isn't acting alone. Russia has quietly entered the equation, exploiting weaknesses in maritime enforcement that reveal just how limited American power projection has become. Together, these developments paint a troubling picture. The tools Washington has relied on for decades, sanctions, technology restrictions, naval superiority, and market access, are losing their effectiveness. So what exactly is happening behind closed doors? How did America's negotiating position become so precarious? And most importantly, what does this mean for the global balance of power moving forward? Let's break down this unfolding crisis, piece by piece. When a Treasury Secretary admits there's no real deal. Scott Bessent chose his words carefully during that interview, but the message underneath was unmistakable. When pressed about the stability of the current understanding with China, he described it as a one-year pause. Not an agreement, not a framework, a pause. Think about what that word actually means. A pause is temporary by definition. It carries no binding commitment, no structural foundation, and certainly no guarantee of what comes next. For the United States Treasury Department to publicly characterize relations with the world's second-largest economy in such uncertain terms represents a dramatic shift in how American officials discuss trade. The soybean question matters more than most people realize. American farmers produced approximately 4.5 billion bushels of soybeans in recent harvest seasons, with China historically absorbing nearly 60% of all U.S. soybean exports. When that market becomes unstable, the ripple effects extend far beyond agriculture. According to recent trade data and Bessent's own public statements, China has committed to purchasing 12 million metric tons of soybeans between November and December of this year. That's followed by projected annual purchases of 25 million metric tons stretching through 2028. If Beijing honors these volumes completely, analysts estimate the arrangement could generate over $32 billion in agricultural revenue during the next several years. Recent cargo movements suggest China is, for now, keeping its word. Reports confirm at least 10 shiploads of American soybeans, valued around $300 million, were purchased following high-level diplomatic communications. These orders provide temporary relief to farming communities and commodity markets alike. But here's the critical context that often gets overlooked. This dependency runs both ways, though not equally. While China needs protein feed for its massive livestock industry, it has increasingly diversified suppliers. Brazil, Argentina, and other South American producers have expanded production capacity specifically to capture market share that once belonged exclusively to American exporters. The United States, meanwhile, lacks comparable alternative markets. No other single buyer can absorb American soybean production at anywhere near the scale China represents. When Beijing reduces purchases, prices collapse across the Midwest. Storage facilities overflow, farm income drops sharply, and political pressure mounts immediately. This creates a dangerous dynamic where agricultural policy becomes hostage to broader geopolitical considerations. The current administration cannot afford to lose support in farming states. These regions represent crucial electoral territory. Maintaining access to Chinese markets isn't simply economic management, it's political survival. And the vulnerability extends far beyond soybeans. American corn exports, pork products, dairy ingredients, and grain sorghum all face similar exposure to Chinese buying decisions. When a single customer controls market access for multiple sectors simultaneously, that customer holds leverage that transcends any individual commodity. That's why Bessent's admission about the one-year pause sent such a clear signal to those paying attention. It acknowledged, however reluctantly, that the United States currently operates without long-term certainty in one of its most important economic relationships. The resource America cannot replace. While agricultural exports grab headlines and political attention, a far more strategic vulnerability has emerged. One that threatens not just farm income, but America's technological and military capabilities. Rare earth elements represent one of modern civilization's least understood but most critical dependencies. These 17 metallic elements possess unique magnetic, luminescent, and electrochemical properties that make them irreplaceable in countless advanced applications. And here's the uncomfortable truth. China controls approximately 70% of global rare earth mining and roughly 90% of processing capacity. The implications are staggering when you understand where these materials actually go. Electric vehicle motors rely heavily on neodymium iron boron magnets, which contain rare earth elements that enable the powerful, lightweight electric motors necessary for competitive range and performance. Without these specific materials, EV production simply cannot scale at current technological standards. Military hardware presents an even more acute dependency. Precision-guided munitions, radar systems, jet engine components, satellite communications, night vision equipment, and advanced targeting systems all require rare earth elements in their manufacturing process. Defense contractors have repeatedly warned that supply disruptions would directly impact production timelines for critical weapons systems. The medical technology sector faces similar constraints. MRI machines, X-ray tubes, and various diagnostic imaging devices incorporate rare earth elements and components where no viable substitutes currently exist at comparable performance levels. And then there's the artificial intelligence infrastructure that increasingly defines technological competitiveness. Data centers, advanced semiconductors, and high-performance computing systems all depend on rare earth materials for cooling systems, power management, and specialized components. During the interview, Bessent confirmed that the current rare earth supply arrangement with China extends only 12 months into the future. After that, everything becomes uncertain. No guarantees exist. No alternative supply chains stand ready. No strategic reserves can bridge more than a brief disruption. This represents a profound strategic weakness. When a potential adversary controls access to materials essential for both economic competitiveness and military readiness, traditional concepts of national security become obsolete. Reports suggest the administration has been scrambling to address this vulnerability. High-level phone calls between Washington and Beijing have allegedly included urgent requests for assurances that rare earth supplies will continue flowing beyond the current one-year window. These conversations reveal just how constrained America's negotiating position has become. If China decided to tighten export controls or impose additional licensing requirements after 12 months, the economic consequences would materialize almost immediately. Stock valuations for companies like Tesla, General Motors, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and numerous technology firms would face instant downward pressure as investors recalculated revenue projections based on supply uncertainty. Manufacturing facilities would slow production or halt entirely while scrambling for alternative materials that may not exist at required specifications. Defense procurement timelines would stretch as contractors struggle to secure necessary inputs for contracted weapons systems. This isn't theoretical speculation. It's the logical outcome of allowing critical supply chain concentration to develop without viable alternatives. And the 12-month clock is already ticking. Taiwan, where geopolitics and technology collide. If rare earth elements represent America's industrial vulnerability, Taiwan embodies something even more complex, a convergence point where territorial disputes, military strategy, and technological supremacy intersect in ways that amplify risk exponentially. Recent diplomatic communications between Washington and Beijing have reportedly included direct discussions about Taiwan's status. According to multiple sources familiar with these exchanges, Chinese leadership has explicitly stated that Taiwan's reunification with mainland China remains central to Beijing's strategic worldview. This wasn't presented as an abstract principle, but rather as a concrete expectation about how the United States should adjust its regional posture. The timing of these conversations coincided with a separate crisis that erupted in Tokyo. Japan's Prime Minister recently suggested that a Chinese military action against Taiwan could potentially justify Japanese defensive responses. Beijing's reaction was swift and severe, warning Chinese citizens against travel to Japan and issuing sharp condemnations that invoked historical grievances about Japanese militarism. What happened next revealed the delicate balancing act Washington now faces. Reports indicate that American officials privately urged their Japanese counterparts to avoid further escalating the rhetoric while sensitive trade negotiations with China remained in progress. The message wasn't necessarily to retract previous statements, but rather to recognize that provocative language could jeopardize the fragile economic arrangements both countries depend on. This diplomatic maneuvering exposes how Taiwan has evolved from a security commitment into a potential bargaining chip, a development that has alarmed defense strategists and technology experts alike. Here's why Taiwan's situation carries implications far beyond regional politics. The island produces approximately 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, commonly known as TSMC, operates fabrication facilities that create the cutting-edge processors powering everything from smartphones to supercomputers, from autonomous vehicles to advanced weapons systems. These aren't commodities that can be sourced elsewhere if supply gets disrupted. The technical expertise, capital investment, and manufacturing precision required to produce chips at TSMC's level of sophistication cannot be replicated quickly. Even with massive investment, building comparable capacity elsewhere would require years of development and hundreds of billions of dollars. This creates a strategic paradox. Any military conflict involving Taiwan would immediately threaten the semiconductor supply that underpins global technology infrastructure. But any diplomatic concession that weakens Taiwan's security guarantees could embolden actions that ultimately produce the same supply disruption. Japan recognizes this clearly. Tokyo fears that Washington might soften its traditional support for Taiwan in exchange for trade concessions from Beijing. Soybeans, rare earths, and market access traded against security commitments. Such a shift wouldn't just affect Taiwan directly, it would fundamentally alter the security architecture across East Asia and potentially destabilize the semiconductor supply chains that Japan's own technology sector depends on. For China, Taiwan's semiconductor dominance provides additional leverage in any negotiation. Beijing understands that merely raising uncertainty about Taiwan's future status can influence how companies allocate investment, how governments structure trade policy, and how markets price geopolitical risk. The result is a situation where Taiwan exists simultaneously as a territorial dispute, a technology choke point, and a negotiating pressure point, all wrapped into one island that sits at the center of 21st century strategic competition. When the AI boom meets the China reality. While geopolitical tensions swirl around Taiwan's semiconductor production, an equally significant crisis is unfolding within the artificial intelligence sector itself, one that threatens the financial assumptions underpinning trillions of dollars in market valuation. The technology boom of recent years has been driven by a single, powerful narrative. Artificial intelligence adoption will continue accelerating indefinitely, generating exponential revenue growth for companies positioned to capitalize on this transformation. Cloud computing providers, chip manufacturers, and software platforms have invested astronomical sums based on this premise, assuming that demand for AI capabilities will remain robust and profit margins will stay elevated. But financial valuation ultimately comes down to mathematics, specifically calculating the present value of expected future cash flows. When those future revenue projections become uncertain, even marginally, the entire valuation structure can collapse with stunning speed, and that uncertainty is arriving from an unexpected direction. China. Recent reports indicate that Chinese regulatory authorities have prohibited ByteDance, the massive technology company behind TikTok and other platforms, from deploying NVIDIA's advanced accelerators in new domestic data centers. This isn't a minor technical adjustment. ByteDance ranks among the world's largest trainers of artificial intelligence models, consuming enormous quantities of computing power to develop and refine the algorithms that power its services. Blocking access to NVIDIA's chips represents more than a commercial obstacle. It's a clear policy decision about where advanced computational capability can legally operate within Chinese territory. This immediately reshapes the economics of artificial intelligence development. If companies like ByteDance must redesign their infrastructure, shift workloads to different architectures, or adopt domestically produced accelerators instead, the ripple effects will strike directly at NVIDIA's revenue projections and those of every American cloud provider that has been counting on Chinese AI demand for growth. Hardware purchasing cycles shift, revenue expectations shrink, and markets begin repricing risk across the entire sector. Here's the deeper problem this reveals. A substantial portion of big tech valuations rests on the assumption of continuous AI-driven revenue expansion. Cloud platforms, semiconductor vendors, and AI-focused companies have justified their stock prices by pointing to projected adoption curves that show relentless upward growth. But what happens if China develops cheaper computational alternatives? What if access to high-performance hardware becomes restricted by policy rather than technology? The growth story that's been priced into American markets begins to unravel. Some investors are already recognizing this shift and reallocating capital toward Chinese AI ecosystems where training costs are lower and expansion is proceeding at remarkable speed. This isn't abstract theory anymore. Concrete evidence shows that China's approach to AI development is becoming increasingly independent of Western hardware and platforms. The implications extend beyond any single company. If the United States loses its position as the essential provider of AI infrastructure, the competitive advantage that has justified premium valuations across the technology sector starts eroding. Revenue growth slows, profit margins compress, and the market recalculates what these companies are actually worth. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Uncertainty about AI revenue prospects affects stock valuations. Falling valuations constrain investment capacity. Reduced investment allows competitors to close technological gaps more quickly, and the cycle accelerates. For policymakers and investors alike, the message is becoming impossible to ignore. America's dominance in artificial intelligence is not guaranteed, and the assumption of perpetual growth may have been dangerously over-optimistic. China's technological workaround strategy. While Washington implements restrictions designed to limit China's access to cutting-edge computing hardware, Chinese companies and researchers have been quietly developing workarounds that threaten to undermine the entire strategy. The approach is sophisticated and multi-layered. Chinese firms are increasingly splitting their artificial intelligence workloads, training large models in offshore data centers where access to advanced hardware remains possible, while running inference operations, the actual application of these models, on domestic chips optimized specifically for that purpose. Simultaneously, engineers are improving software architectures and optimization techniques to extract significantly more computational output from less expensive hardware. By redesigning algorithms and improving efficiency at the code level, they're effectively achieving comparable results with processors that cost substantially less than premium American accelerators. This adaptation represents a serious threat to companies like NVIDIA, AMD, and Intel. These firms have built business models around premium pricing for top-tier chips, operating under the assumption that foreign competitors cannot match performance without access to their specific hardware. If Chinese companies can achieve similar AI capabilities using cheaper or domestically manufactured processors, American vendors face a devastating double-impact: reduced demand for expensive hardware combined with increased competitive pressure in global markets. It's not simply about lost sales in the short term. This represents potential market share erosion across artificial intelligence, cloud computing, and next-generation technologies where profit margins are highest and technological leadership matters most. From a strategic perspective, this development proves that dependence on American hardware is no longer inevitable. The combination of improved chip utilization, offshore training capabilities, and domestic inference solutions creates a viable pathway for China to maintain AI competitiveness independently of Western technology suppliers. For investors who have bid up technology stocks based on assumptions about sustained demand and pricing power, this represents a fundamental challenge to the growth thesis. If these workarounds scale successfully, and early evidence suggests they're already operational at significant volume, then revenue projections and company valuations across the semiconductor and cloud computing sectors may require substantial downward revision. The broader implication is equally concerning. Technology restrictions that were supposed to slow China's AI development may instead accelerate the creation of an entirely separate technological ecosystem that operates beyond American influence or benefit. When naval power meets practical limits. While attention focuses on technology and trade, another revealing development has quietly unfolded at sea, one that demonstrates the practical limits of American power projection in an era of asymmetric evasion tactics. A Russian-flagged tanker, identified in public reporting as operating within the so-called Shadow Fleet, successfully navigated into Venezuelan waters after days of maneuvering specifically designed to avoid United States interdiction. American naval forces tracked the vessel's movements, shadowed its route, and reportedly attempted to block its approach 6 days before it reached its destination. But ultimately, Washington chose to stand down rather than risk the escalation that would come from forcibly stopping the ship, and the tanker completed its journey. This single arrival carries strategic significance that extends far beyond one vessel or one shipment. It demonstrates the inherent difficulties of maritime enforcement when ships employ flags of convenience, obscure ownership structures, and deliberate operational tactics designed to exploit legal and political constraints. A naval destroyer can shadow a commercial tanker across thousands of miles of ocean. But actually stopping that vessel requires ironclad legal justification and creates political and military risks that administrations increasingly choose to avoid. Shadow fleets exploit precisely those gaps in enforcement capability, and here's what makes this particularly dangerous. If one sanctioned tanker can successfully navigate around American interdiction efforts, the tactic becomes immediately scalable. Other vessels will follow the same playbook. Additional routes will open, energy flows will increase, and the sanctions regime that was supposed to isolate targeted nations begins losing its effectiveness. One successful run isn't an isolated incident, it's proof of concept. It's the blueprint for systematic evasion. This maritime development connects directly to the broader pattern we've been examining. China uses export controls on rare earth elements to pressure American industrial capacity. Beijing shapes where advanced computing can legally operate, directly impacting companies like NVIDIA. Russia undermines maritime sanctions enforcement to sustain energy partnerships with isolated regimes. These moves aren't coincidental. They reinforce each other as part of a coordinated pressure matrix that systematically blunts America's traditional tools of influence: tariffs, sanctions, technology controls, and naval presence. The result isn't dramatic collapse or sudden defeat. It's something potentially more dangerous: a steady, almost imperceptible erosion of United States leverage across multiple domains that previously guaranteed influence. Minerals flow or don't flow based on Chinese policy decisions. Shipping routes remain open or close based on the willingness to risk escalation. Advanced technology markets fragment based on regulatory barriers that Washington can no longer fully control. Each individual development might seem manageable in isolation, but collectively, they represent a fundamental shift in how power operates in the international system.